It was the third rainy day in a row. Warsaw, for all its undeniable charm, could on such days appear sombre and oppressive. The cobbled streets lay drowned in dampness, while the filth, stirred by raindrops striking the ground, rose into the air like a heavy mist. The city seemed to breathe more slowly, as though it too had grown weary of the weather. Apolinary closed the door of his antiquarian bookshop shortly after bidding farewell to Mrs. Rutkowska, one of the most faithful and frequent visitors the place had known for years. As always, the elderly lady paused briefly in the doorway, casting one last glance at the shelves crowded with books and curios. Then, with a cordial nod, she disappeared into the rain. He was alone. Apolinary turned the small sign hanging on the door so that the word "Secreto" faced the street. He performed this task with the same calm precision he applied to all the minor rituals that marked the end of his working day. He extinguished the light in the main room, checked that the door was properly secured, and made his way to the back. There lay his office, modest yet immaculately kept. He lit the oil lamp, which spilled a warm, yellowish glow across the room, and set the kettle on to boil. When the water was ready, he brewed himself a cup of tea and added a touch of honey. He favoured the taste, simple, soothing, unchanging. He sat down at the desk. For a brief moment, he stared at the blank sheet of paper before him, as though to assure himself that nothing yet existed upon it. Then he reached for his pen, the same black pen with which he had committed his thoughts to paper for years. He dipped the nib into the inkwell, drew a quiet breath, and began to write. "My dearest Maria, the weather in Warsaw is unkind once more. The rain seems endless, and the city, tired as if weighed down by its own burden, lingers in a damp half-light. On days like these, it is easier to listen to one's own thoughts, though they are not always the most welcome company. I have observed that rain possesses a peculiar quality. It washes forth those memories we usually keep carefully buried, laying them before us without any concern for our consent. Perhaps that is why I have always felt that melancholy and I are better acquainted than propriety would allow one to admit. It has now been 5 years, 6 months, and 12 days since I last saw you. There is not a day that passes without my asking myself the same questions. Where are you? Are you well? And, are you alive at all? There are nights, Maria, when sleep avoids me entirely, and I lie in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, repeating a single, relentless question. Where did you truly go? And did you leave at all? Yet these thoughts soon give way to others, more persistent still. Even if it were true that you travelled to visit your family in the south of France, why did you not take your emerald locket with you? The very same one that almost always rested against your breast, as though it were a part of you. And why, Maria? Why do you not reply to my letters?" Apolinary paused. He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and drew out the locket. The green stone, set in gold, caught the lamp's warm light for a fleeting moment. He turned it slowly between his fingers, as though expecting it to return his gaze. After a moment's reflection, he closed his hand around it and set the jewel beside the inkwell. Once more, he took up the pen. "In any case, Maria, I shall not cease writing to you, even if my words are destined only for silence, returning to me like an echo. So long as there is ink left, I shall believe that somewhere, on the other side, someone is reading them. In this letter, I wish to tell you of yet another affair into which, quite against my will, I found myself drawn last week." He hesitated. For a moment the pen hovered above the page, as though it, too, were uncertain where to begin. A few days earlier, Apolinary Woynicz had been standing in the doorway of his Warsaw shop, listening to the steady tapping of rain against the stones. The sound had accompanied him since morning, and nothing suggested it might cease before day's end. At such moments, Warsaw seemed shrunken, turned inward upon itself, as if the city were quietly enduring the foul weather, paying no heed to anyone. It was an entirely ordinary day. one of many he had learned to live through without expectation. Behind the counter moved Zofia, a woman in her early 50s, his employee and invaluable assistance for many years. She knew the shop almost as well as he did himself, which books were not to be shifted unnecessarily, which objects required daily dusting, and which were best left untouched. Apolinary trusted her without reservation. Therefore, without hesitation, he left the shop in her care, throwing his coat over his shoulders as he stepped outside. As always, he began the day with coffee. In one of the cafes he frequented so often that no order was required, the cup appeared before him almost at once. He lingered only briefly, allowing his thoughts to settle into some manner of order. From there he went to the bakery, where he purchased a loaf still warm from the oven, then to the print shop to collect his commissioned materials, and on to the bookshop, where he set aside several titles that might interest his clientele. At last, as he did every day, he turned his steps toward the post office. It was a ritual he never omitted, regardless of the weather, his mood, or how insistently he told himself that no news ought to be expected. He stood in line, collected his correspondence, and for one short, painful moment allowed himself hope. Maria. She had been his wife, his partner in work and in life, a noblewoman from a family that, at the beginning of the 19th century, had left Poland to settle in France. He himself came from impoverished nobility, yet never regarded this as a source of shame. Together, they had established an office spoken of widely and with admiration. They took on cases others had deemed hopeless. Their names circulated throughout Warsaw, and rumours of their successes reached as far as Prussian and Austrian lands. They had been an influential couple, at least for a time. One day, Maria announced that she wished to visit her family in France, alone. There was nothing in her voice to suggest a final farewell, and Apolinary, trusting her utterly, did not protest. The day of her departure was forever etched in his memory as the darkest of days, the day his beloved boarded the train and never returned. At the post office, as usual, there was no letter from her. That did not surprise him. What did surprise him was something else. Among the bills and minor correspondence lay an invitation, not an ordinary one, nor merely a polite courtesy, but an invitation to the wedding of the daughter of an old acquaintance. The family was well known to him. Eleonora, the bride's mother, had for years belonged to Maria's closest circle. They had remained in contact long after life had scattered them across different corners of Europe. Apolinary lingered beneath the post office walls for a moment, the envelope held in his hand, before moving on. He did not yet know that this letter would mark the beginning of a matter destined to reopen old wounds and compel him to look once more where he had long since ceased wishing to search. As he walked back toward the antiquarian shop, he kept his eyes fixed upon the wet paving stones as though seeking an answer in the fractured lines between them, an answer that had given him no peace since leaving the post office. The invitation rested in the inner pocket of his coat, yet he felt its weight as if still holding it. Should he accept? The first obstacle was distance itself. Eleonora resided in a small town not far from Vienna, a fact which alone ensured that the journey would be neither swift nor simple. It required several long hours spent between trains and crowded stations, followed by yet another stretch undertaken by carriage, from the railway terminus to her estate. It was a passage that carried him far beyond the boundaries of his everyday world, into a realm governed by different habits, different expectations, and a pace of life to which he had long ceased to be accustomed. The second reason was the season. Autumn had never been his favourite time. For him, it was a period of retreat, of gradual closure, of ordering thoughts and shelves alike, both those in the shop and those in his own mind. Balls, feasts, a wedding filled with music and laughter, all seemed almost inappropriate at such a time, like loud laughter in an empty church. He felt neither the desire nor the strength to celebrate another's joy. Yet there was a third reason, one he could not have voiced aloud even to himself had he tried. To meet someone so close to Maria was to return to memories he had learned to handle only with the utmost care. Eleonora had known her well. She had seen her happy, full of plans, before the silence that followed her departure. Apolinary feared that a single careless word, a gesture or recollection might tear open wounds that, though never healed, had at least ceased to bleed. He paused before the shop door, withdrew his key, and hesitated before inserting it into the lock. The rain was still falling, steady and unrelenting, as though to remind him that some decisions could not be postponed indefinitely. The invitation was waiting, and with it, a question he would, sooner or later, be compelled to answer. A few days passed, and Apolinary found himself boarding a train bound for Krakow, his valises entrusted to the care of the conductor. In the compartment assigned to him, there was only one other passenger, an elderly woman seated near the door, who slept through nearly the entire journey. The sounds of her snoring made it difficult for Apolinary to collect his thoughts. He wondered, not for the first time, how such a thing was even possible, sleeping upright, in a moving train. He himself had been given a window seat and took quiet pleasure in it, for it allowed him to observe the autumn landscapes unfolding beyond the glass for the length of the journey. In his hands he held the very invitation to which he had, at last, responded in the affirmative. He had decided to attend the ceremony. Maria would have delighted in such an occasion. Festivities, banquets, balls, concerts, gatherings of every sort, she had always been drawn to them with an enthusiasm he had admired and never quite shared. He therefore concluded that by agreeing to take part in this wedding and its celebrations, he was, in some small way, paying tribute to his missing wife. Now, as the train carried him deeper into the south of Poland, a land that, at present, existed not as a sovereign state, but as a divided territory under three powers, Prussian, Austrian, and Russian, he attempted to arrange in his mind the background of the marriage that awaited him. Eleonora was Polish by birth, yet at the age of 19, her family, residing in Galicia, had chosen to align themselves with Austria by marrying her off to a wealthy Austrian nobleman, Friedrich von Reichenbach, from an influential house. Why they had done so was difficult to say. Perhaps it had been a calculated attempt to secure advantageous connections and gain favour with the occupying Austrians. Or perhaps it had been driven by necessity. Eleonora's parents' estate had been steadily dwindling, and they had treated their daughter as a final lifeline, offering her hand to a man of considerable means. Eleonora herself, however, had always assured Apolinary and Maria at each of their meetings that the marriage would never extinguish her Polish spirit. She promised that Polish traditions would be preserved in her home, that the language of her childhood would be spoken within its walls and passed on to her children. At present, she had two, a 12-year-old son, Joseph, and an 18-year-old daughter, Clara. It was Clara who now faced a fate strikingly similar to that of her mother. She was to marry a young Austrian captain in his early 20s, Johann von Hellefeld, thereby binding the family even more tightly to the occupying power and further eroding its Polish roots. Clara was already half Polish, half Austrian. Her children, in turn, would be Polish by only a quarter. Yet he did not permit himself, even for a moment, to pass judgment upon anyone involved in the matter. He himself, though Polish to the marrow and devoted to his homeland with his whole heart, would not allow that devotion to cloud his rational judgment. He understood the reality in which he lived, and he understood equally well that survival within it demanded swift adaptation, flexibility, and a willingness to adjust. Over the years, he had formed numerous acquaintances and even friendships among all three occupying powers. Within his circle, one could find Russians, Prussians, and Austrians alike. He spoke 4 languages: Polish, his mother tongue; French, the language of salons and palaces; German, indispensable for movement within Prussian and Austrian territories; and Russian, the one he knew most intimately of the latter 3. Warsaw lay within the domain of the Tsar, under Russian rule, and thus he used that language much as he did Polish, daily, naturally, when attending to practical matters, dealing with Russian officials, and during his frequent journeys into the Russian Empire. Long ago, he had ceased to distinguish people by nationality or origin. He knew that what defined a man were his actions and his intentions, not the language he spoke, nor the land upon which he lived. Apolinary was well aware that he himself was often judged by others. Rumours circled about him. In certain quarters, he was derided as a cursed Russophile, even branded a traitor. Yet he had long since stopped troubling himself with such talk and paid it no further heed. In Krakow, Apolinary changed trains. The connection to Vienna proved markedly different from the one he had just left behind. Having secured a first-class ticket, he was shown into a comfortable carriage furnished with upholstered seats and polished wooden tables, its interior imbued with the discreet elegance favoured by the Austro-Hungarian railways. There was room to stretch one's legs, to think, even if one were so inclined, to forget the journey for a moment altogether. He took a seat by one of the small tables and ordered coffee. It had scarcely been set before him when a man of middle age approached, hat in hand, and asked, politely with a distinct accent, whether the seat opposite was taken. Apolinary indicated that it was free. The man introduced himself as Václav Novak, a Czech by birth, with thoughtful eyes and a face worn more by experience than by age. He spoke German fluently, though its cadence carried the unmistakable softness of Bohemia. Before long, courtesy gave way to conversation, and conversation to confession. "I lived in Krakow for 2 years," Novak said presently, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "I married a Polish woman." Apolinary inclined his head, inviting him to continue. "Her name was Helena," the man went on. "I met her at the theatre. Friends had arranged the evening. She was charming, sweet, gentle. She seemed attentive, affectionate, possessed of a good and generous heart. I thought myself extraordinarily fortunate." He paused, then allowed himself a thin smile. It was after the wedding that everything began to change. According to Novak, Helena grew cold, then sharp. Her kindness evaporated, not only toward him, but toward the servants as well. She became demanding, critical, prone to sudden fits of temper. At first, he told himself that something must have happened to her, some hidden sorrow, some wound he did not yet understand. He searched for reasons, excuses, explanations. "In time," he said quietly, "I realized there was nothing to explain. This was who she truly was." Only later, after difficult conversations with her family, did the truth fully emerge. Helena had always possessed a difficult temperament. More than one man had withdrawn from her before marriage. The woman he had fallen in love with, the mild, radiant figure from the theatre, had been a carefully constructed illusion. "A mask," Novak said, meeting Apollinary's gaze at last. "One she wore only until she no longer saw the need to pretend, until she was certain I belonged to her." He leaned back in his seat. "You must remember, Mr. Apolinary," he added softly, "that some people possess a remarkable talent, the manipulation of their own image. Like master chefs, effortlessly preparing even the most difficult dishes, they assume roles with ease and compel others to believe that the part they are playing is their true self." Shortly thereafter, Novak rose, offered his farewells, and disembarked at one of the Austrian stations along the route, leaving behind his words, which lingered longer than Apolinary might have wished. By the time the train drew into Vienna, night had already begun to settle over the city. And there, waiting in front of the station, beside a handsome horse-drawn carriage, stood Friedrich. The moment Apolinary caught sight of him standing beside a carriage, a lit cigar held between his fingers, something within him stirred. Perhaps it was the simple pleasure of seeing a familiar face after so many years, or perhaps it was the sudden rush of nostalgia that took hold of him without warning. Memories surfaced at once, evenings spent strolling through Viennese streets, he with Maria at his side, Friedrich accompanied by Eleonora, long dinners and card games played over glasses of wine to which he and Maria had so often been invited back when she was still a living presence in his life. "Apolinary, my dear friend, how good it is to see you," Friedrich exclaimed at the sight of him. He was a man of neither striking looks nor impressive stature, stocky, with a rather ordinary round face made memorable chiefly by his distinctive moustache. Apolinary walked toward him without hesitation. "Friedrich, how many years has it been since we last met?" he replied warmly, clapping the man on the shoulder in greeting. They entered the carriage and were soon on their way. Apolinary had never been fond of travelling after nightfall, yet fortune favoured him in this regard. The town in which Friedrich and Eleonora resided lay just beyond Vienna, and the carriage itself was fitted with lanterns fixed on either side. Their steady glow illuminated the road ahead for the coachman, casting long, wavering shadows across the path. "Tell me, Friedrich," Apolinary said after a moment, as the rhythm of the wheels settled into a steady cadence. "How is your wife? I have not seen Eleonora since Maria and I last visited you, but never mind." Friedrich shifted slightly in his seat. "Eleonora has not quite been herself of late," he replied. "She behaves strangely. Perhaps it is the wedding. One does not give away one's only daughter every day, and certainly not to just anyone, but to a young and ambitious captain, no less. At 22, Johann has already achieved a remarkable number of distinctions." "Have you had the opportunity to become better acquainted with your future son-in-law?" Apolinary asked. "I would not say well acquainted," Friedrich admitted. "We have played a few games of poker, gone hunting once, perhaps twice, but that is scarcely enough to truly know a man. For the moment, he gives the impression of being orderly, courteous, independent, and disciplined, which leads me to believe that by placing my daughter in his hands, I may rest assured that she will be safe and well provided for." "I should say," Apolinary remarked with a faint smile, "that the key phrase here is, 'he gives the impression.'" Friedrich did not respond at once. "And how are matters with your esteemed mother?" Apolinary asked gently, changing the subject. "My mother," Friedrich hesitated. "How might I put it? It is complicated. I would rather not speak of it just now." Apolinary did not press him. He sensed that something had occurred, something Friedrich was not prepared to put into words, and he had no wish to draw forth sentiments better left undisturbed. After nearly 2 hours of travel, the carriage finally turned onto a long, tree-lined drive. They had arrived at Montval, the estate at which Apolinary was to remain a guest for the next several days. At the entrance to the palace, a woman of advanced years was waiting for them, a loyal servant who had remained in the family's service for many years, Mrs. Anna Kowalczyk. "Mr. Woynicz, how lovely it is to see you again," she exclaimed, stepping forward at once to assist with his luggage. "My dear Anna," Apolinary replied with equal warmth, "so much time has passed, and yet you have not changed in the slightest." He was well known for his gallantry toward women and his unfailingly gracious manner. He kissed the servant's hand in greeting and took hold of another valise himself. "If you will permit me, sir, I shall show you to your chamber," the woman said after a moment, her voice still pleasant, despite the long hour. "But of course," Apolinary answered, "I would be honoured by your company." They took their leave of Friedrich, and Apolinary followed Anna into the palace. As they walked along its quiet corridors, lit only by scattered lamps, the building struck him as larger than he remembered, more spacious, more labyrinthine, as though time itself had stretched its walls. The palace at night seemed to breathe differently, and with every step, Apolinary felt the peculiar sensation of entering a place where the past had not entirely released its hold. They walked on in silence for a short while, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone floors. "It must be a demanding time for you," Apolinary said at length. "A wedding of this scale requires no small amount of preparation." Anna smiled, though the expression did not entirely reach her eyes. "Oh, indeed, sir. There is much to be done, always something to arrange, something to revise. The house has not known such activity in years." "And the household bears it well?" Apolinary asked lightly. "As best it can," she replied after a brief pause. "The younger servants are full of energy, of course. For them, everything is new, everything is exciting." She adjusted her grip on the lamp she carried, the flame flickering as they turned a corner. "There are changes," she added carefully, "new ways of doing things." "I imagine so," Apolinary said. "Preparations of this sort often bring change in their wake." "Yes," Anna said quietly, "and not only where the wedding is concerned." She hesitated, as if weighing her words. "For instance," she continued, lowering her voice, though no one else was near, "last winter, at Christmas, well, things were rather different. No carp, no beet soup, no poppy seed dishes. Instead, there were roasted meats, heavy sauces, spiced wine, the sort they favour in Austria." Apolinary glanced at her, saying nothing. "We were told," she went on, "that it was more proper so, that such customs were more suitable now, and that the household should conduct itself accordingly." "Including the language?" Apolinary asked gently. Anna gave a small, resigned nod. "These days, one is expected to speak only German within the walls of the palace. Even among ourselves," she added. "Old habits are not encouraged." She stopped before a tall door and turned to face him at last. "Forgive me, sir," she said quickly, a hint of unease entering her voice. "It is not my place to complain. I am grateful to this family. I always have been. Still, when one has served a house for so many years, one grows attached not only to the people, but to the ways things were done." "I understand," Apolinary said softly. Anna inclined her head, relieved that he had not pressed her further. "This is your chamber, Mr. Woynicz," she said, opening the door. "If there is anything you require, please do not hesitate to call." As she withdrew, Apolinary remained for a moment where he was, her words settling in his mind like dust disturbed and slow to fall. Change, he thought, always arrived quietly at first, disguised as improvement. Apolinary decided to postpone unpacking his valises until the following day, granting precedence to rest after the long and tiring journey. Once he had changed into his nightclothes, settled comfortably into bed, and begun to let his eyelids droop, he heard something. The sound came from beyond the door, from the corridor. It resembled hurried footsteps, as though someone were running along its length. Apolinary belonged to that particular breed of men whose curiosity could be stirred by the smallest irregularity, details others would scarcely register. He rose at once, crossed the room in 2 swift strides, and eased the door open, leaving only a narrow gap. At the far end of the corridor, he caught sight of a figure in motion, running, then vanishing around a corner. It was too dark for him to distinguish anything more. A moment later, another sound reached him. His chamber had 2 large windows overlooking the expansive garden behind the palace. Before retiring, he had allowed himself the small indulgence of opening one of them slightly so that fresh air might circulate through the room during the night, a habit he had long believed essential to sound sleep. Through that opening now came a faint disturbance. He moved quickly to the window and looked out. There, once again, he glimpsed a silhouette, likely the same one, this time running across the garden, keeping low, as though fearful of being seen. Apolinary watched as the figure disappeared among the shrubs, swallowed by shadow and foliage alike. He stood there for a moment longer, considering what he had seen. At last, he returned to his bed. Drawing the covers up, He hoped that no further disturbances would present themselves, and that rest, delayed but not entirely denied, might finally claim him. My dearest Maria, I was glad, my love, to reach the estate of Eleonora and Friedrich safely and with comparatively little disturbance. My heart was lightened as well by the simple pleasure of seeing familiar faces after so many years apart. And yet, I could not help but notice certain matters that struck me as peculiar, or at the very least, deserving of attention. You know me well enough to expect this. Another might say that I search for details where none truly exist. But even if that were so, those details have never yet led me astray. After my meeting with Friedrich during our evening journey through the darkness, I observed his unmistakable discomfort when I asked after his mother, Lady Adelheid von Reichenbach. Beyond the obvious hesitation in his reply, he began nervously twisting the family signet ring upon his finger, as though something weighed upon him that he could not, or would not, express. Another matter that engaged my interest was my conversation with Anna, from which one might reasonably conclude that Eleonora has all but forgotten the Polish identity she once vowed to preserve, choosing instead to integrate herself fully into the customs of the land she now calls home. Yet it was not merely the substance of Anna's words that struck me as odd, but the tone in which she delivered them. I sensed a certain resentment toward the Reichenbach family, or perhaps a clear reluctance, even distaste, for the German customs Eleonora has seen fit to impose upon the household. And then, of course, there were the nocturnal disturbances of my sleep. Who would run through the corridors of a palace at such an hour, and for what purpose? Why flee through the garden, and to where? I confess that when I first glimpsed the silhouette in the corridor, I briefly wondered whether it might be Joseph, Eleonora's son, but that thought quickly lost its force, for a dash through the garden would have made little sense in such a case. In any event, I resolved at the time to keep these observations to myself. Apolinary broke away from the letter once more and, taking a few sips of his tea, allowed his thoughts to drift back to that morning, the day on which he had, for the first time since his arrival, shared breakfast with the Reichenbach family. Despite the mysterious figure running through the corridors having briefly disturbed his rest during the night, he had eventually fallen asleep again and remained so until morning. He was awakened by the sounds of the household coming to life, the servants moving back and forth along the corridors with trays in hand, and by the song of garden birds drifting in through the open window. After completing his morning rituals, Apolinary made his way downstairs, where nearly the entire family awaited him in the dining room. Friedrich alone was absent, having been called away early to attend to matters in the city. Eleonora was the first to notice him standing in the passage between the drawing room and the dining room. With unmistakable excitement written across her face, she hurried toward him and threw her arms around his neck. "Thank God, Apolinary, you are alive and well. I was so afraid that I might never see you again, just as I—" She stopped herself abruptly, realizing too late that she had pressed upon a wound which had never truly healed since the mysterious disappearance of his wife. Apolinary, who was not fond of displaying his emotions in public, merely smiled and returned her embrace warmly. "You may rest assured, Eleonora," he replied with gentle irony, "that I have no particular haste to depart for the next world." When at last she withdrew, she looked at him with a curious expression, one that seemed to carry unspoken expectations, as though she hoped he might soon fulfill them. "You cannot imagine how glad we are to see you," she said earnestly. "How grateful we are that you came. I, at least, am deeply grateful." "I assure you, my dear," Apolinary answered, "that your invitation provided me with an excellent excuse to escape, for a while, the gloomy and oppressive Warsaw of which I had begun to grow rather weary." "Come, Apolinary," Eleonora said, gesturing toward the table. "You must sit here, beside me." Even past 40, she had not lost the grace and charm that had always been part of her nature. She indicated the chair next to her own, where cutlery and a plate had already been laid. Before taking his seat, however, Apolinary allowed his gaze to travel briefly around the table. There sat Alexander, Eleonora's younger brother, a man Apolinary would have described as an untamed stallion, one who prized freedom, risk and adventure, stubborn, at times explosive. And yet, Apolinary liked him. He embodied something many people seemed determined to suppress or conceal, the quality of authenticity, unvarnished and sincere. Opposite him sat Eleonora's young son, 12-year-old Joseph, who had inherited from his father a head of blonde curls that fell into a state of perfect disorder. He was prodding distractedly at the scrambled eggs on his plate. Beside him sat the bride herself, Clara, lovely and fragile in appearance. Looking at her, Apolinary quickly realized that since his last meeting with the Reichenbach family, it was she who had changed the most. He remembered her as a child, only a few years ago, a quiet, unremarkable girl, a grey mouse scarcely noticed among her peers. Now, however, she undeniably drew the eye. She possessed long, fair hair that fell gracefully down her back and a delicate face, almost angelic in its serenity. Looking at her, Apolinary found himself wondering whether her character would one day prove as gentle and harmonious as her appearance suggested, or whether, like so many people he had known, she concealed depths not immediately visible to the eye. The thought accompanied him as he finally took the seat Eleonora had indicated, just as a servant stepped forward at once to pour him coffee. "Milk or cream, sir?" the young woman asked. "Black will be quite sufficient, thank you," he replied. "And whatever you recommend?" She nodded and retreated, leaving before him a plate arranged with care. For a few moments, the table was filled only with the sounds of cutlery and porcelain. "So," Eleonora said at last, her tone light, almost deliberately so, "tell us, Apolinary, how fares your shop in Warsaw? I imagine it has not grown any quieter with the years." "On the contrary," he answered, "books and old objects seem to multiply all on their own, as do the people in search of them. One grows accustomed to the noise." "I always said you had chosen wisely," Eleonora replied. "A man with your mind requires occupation. Idleness would never suit you." Alexander snorted softly into his cup. "Occupation is all very well," he said, "but I should imagine Warsaw offers rather more than dusty shelves and quiet customers." Apolinary smiled, but before he could respond, Eleonora continued. "It is stability that matters," she said firmly. "Something one can rely upon." Her gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward Clara. "And that," she added, "is precisely what Johann represents." Clara looked up from her plate. "I do not see stability as a virtue in itself," she said quietly, "at least not when it resembles rigidity." The words fell into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Eleonora frowned, not sharply, but with a controlled displeasure. "My dear," she said, "Johann possesses a sense of order and purpose that is rare in men of his generation. He understands position, responsibility, and what is expected of him. Qualities like these are not to be dismissed lightly." "They are not qualities I admire," Clara replied, her voice remaining soft, though her fingers tightened slightly around her fork. Alexander leaned back in his chair. "Now that," he said with a glance toward his niece, "is something I understand perfectly." Eleonora turned to him at once. "This is hardly the time," she said sharply. "Nor the place, perhaps," Alexander agreed. "But the matter remains. I always believed Clara would be better suited to a man who shared her roots." "Roots do not secure a future," Eleonora retorted. "Connections do." Apolinary watched Clara closely. She had grown unusually pale, her attention seemingly fixed somewhere beyond the table. Save for those few remarks, she had remained silent, withdrawn into herself as though present only in body. Without warning, she rose. "Please excuse me," she said too quickly. I feel unwell. Before anyone could respond, she turned and left the room. For a moment, no one spoke. She is merely overwrought, Eleonora said at last, the excitement of the approaching wedding. Yet Apolinary noted that Clara had shown none of the eager anticipation one might reasonably expect of a bride so soon to be wed. Her departure had not carried the lightness of nerves, but something closer to distress. Alexander said nothing. He simply stared after her, jaw set. Apolinary lowered his gaze to his cup. Inwardly, he could not rid himself of the impression that the most important voice at the table was the one that had just fallen silent. After breakfast, when the table had begun to empty and the servants moved quietly about clearing the dishes, Alexander pushed back his chair and rose. "Apolinary," he said, "would you care to join me for a short walk in the gardens?" "With pleasure," Apolinary replied at once. The air outside was crisp and clear, the morning sun resting lightly upon the dew-laced grass. The Gardens of Montval were well kept, though less rigid than those he had seen around Viennese estates. There remained here a certain looseness, a refusal to be entirely tamed. For a while, they walked in silence. "At breakfast," Alexander said suddenly, "you may have noticed that my sister and I do not see eye to eye on every matter." That much was difficult to miss, Apolinary answered mildly. Alexander exhaled sharply through his nose. When Eleonora and Friedrich first announced their intention to find a suitable match for Clara, I took it very much to heart, he said. I spent months, Apolinary, drawing up my own list of candidates. "A list?" Apolinary repeated. "Yes, young Polish men," Alexander continued, warming to the subject. "From good families, respectable names, secure fortunes, educated, serious-minded, men who, in my opinion, were in no way inferior to this Austrian captain." "And your sister?" Apolinary asked. Alexander let out a humourless laugh. When I finally brought the list to her, she exploded, said she had never asked for my interference, that Clara would marry an Austrian, not a Pole. She did not wish to hear who these men were, nor from which families they came. It was enough for her that they were Polish for her to reject them outright. Apolinary stopped walking. "That is unlike the Eleonora I knew," he said carefully. "She once spoke with great conviction of her devotion to her homeland, of the soil she was born upon, of the traditions she considered sacred, and of her determination to preserve them no matter where life had carried her." "So she did," Alexander replied darkly, before Friedrich's mother began whispering in her ear. "The Baroness?" Apolinary asked. Alexander nodded. She never forgave Eleonora for her fondness for Polish ways. She called it provincial, inconvenient, a liability, and Eleonora, whether out of exhaustion or ambition, eventually chose another path. If one wished to win the Baroness's favour, one did not speak Polish, nor surround one's children with it. They walked on a few steps more. "I must admit," Alexander went on, "I did not expect to see you arrive so early." Apolinary turned to him. "Early? Yes, the wedding is not until next week, after all." Apolinary came to an abrupt halt. "Next week?" he repeated. "What do you mean, next week?" Alexander frowned. "Oh, forgive me," he said, a touch of uncertainty entering his voice. "I assumed my sister had informed you. All the guests were notified. The ceremony was postponed. Clara has not been well these past days." Apollinary's expression darkened for the briefest moment, an irritation he made a visible effort to restrain. "Well," he said evenly, "it would appear that not everyone was." "I beg your pardon, Apolinary. I truly thought my sister had made you aware of it." "There is no need for apologies, my friend," Apolinary replied calmly. "It was not you who was responsible for the invitations. As for your sister, however, there is a serious conversation awaiting us." With that, they resumed their walk in silence, their footsteps slow and unhurried, as they took in the quiet charm of the morning gardens. The sunlight filtered gently through the trees, and for a time neither felt the need to disturb the stillness with words. After some time, Alexander glanced at his pocket watch and slowed his pace. "I must leave you for now," he said. "There are matters that require my attention." "Of course," Apolinary replied. "I thank you for the company." They parted with a brief handshake, and Apolinary continued on alone, allowing his steps to wander where they pleased. He had always been fond of nature. As far back as his memory reached, it had offered him a quiet companionship no human presence could quite replace. And though the gardens now lacked the vivid colours of summer, autumn lent them a different charm, muted, calm, restorative. There was something consoling in the ordered decay of leaves, in the stillness that preceded winter. Walking along one of the narrow paths, he came upon an elderly man with greying hair, bent over a shrub near the edge of the garden. The man worked carefully, his hands steady despite his years. Apolinary recognized the familiar face at once. It was Antoni Malinowski, another long-serving member of the Reichenbach household, who had tended these gardens for as long as anyone could remember. "Good morning," Apolinary said. The gardener looked up, visibly startled, then straightened and smiled in recognition. "Well, I'll be, Mr. Woynicz. It has been many years." "Indeed it has," Apolinary replied warmly. "It is good to see you again, Antoni. You have not changed." "Well, Mr. Woynicz," the gardener said with a small chuckle, "I scarcely believed my own eyes when I saw you here again. It has been years." "Indeed it has," Apolinary replied. "The place feels both familiar and strangely changed." "A great many things are different now," the man said, straightening his back. "But some remain as they were. These paths, for instance, you walked them more than once before." "That is true," Apolinary said. "I remember them well enough." "Time has a way of circling back," the gardener added simply. "Yes," Apolinary agreed. "It does." "And your wife?" the gardener asked kindly. "She is not with you this time?" Apolinary hesitated only for a fraction of a second, noting at once that the gardener appeared entirely unaware of what had become of Maria. "Unfortunately, she was unable to join me," he said, offering a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Malinowski nodded, sensing, perhaps instinctively, that no further questions were required. "And what occupies your attention this morning?" Apolinary asked, gesturing toward the damaged shrub. "Something, or someone, ran straight through it last night," the gardener replied. "I first thought it might have been a fox, but the tracks didn't sit right with me. Still, the poor thing needs mending." Apollinary's gaze drifted instinctively toward the palace. From this angle, he could clearly see the windows of his chamber overlooking the garden. Slowly, almost unconsciously, his eyes traced a path from that spot across the lawn, through the very shrubs Malinowski now repaired. The route matched. Exactly. Before he could dwell further on the thought, the sound of laughter reached his ears. A woman's laugh, light, genuine. He turned and saw Clara seated near the fountain some distance away, in the company of a young man he did not recognize. She held a notebook in her hands, while the man appeared to be explaining something, gesturing occasionally toward its pages. Clara looked different now. The tension he had observed at the breakfast table seemed to have loosened its grip. She sat more freely, her posture open, allowing herself brief smiles, small but unguarded. Malinowski followed Apollinary's line of sight. "You are looking at Monsieur Etienne Moreau," he said. "He is French, 27, I believe. He teaches young Miss Clara and Mr. Joseph French and literature, has done so for a year now, since the previous governess was dismissed." "How often do they study?" Apolinary asked. "Several times a week," the gardener replied. though Miss Clara may be found in his company more often than that, she seems more at ease with him than with her own parents. He lowered his voice slightly. Though the tutor lodges in the city and must travel here for lessons, on his free days he often takes her walking in the gardens. Apolinary considered this in silence, his eyes still resting upon the pair by the fountain. Clara laughed again, and this time it sounded entirely unburdened. For a long moment, Apolinary stood quite still, the morning air cool against his face, quietly arranging these new observations alongside the others. Some patterns, he reflected, revealed themselves only when one knew where to look. As noon slowly approached, Apolinary, who, after his walk through the gardens, had spent some time in his chamber unpacking his valises and restoring a sense of order to his surroundings, now sat on the rear terrace of the palace. He had settled into a comfortable chair, a book resting open in his hands. It was a recent Russian acquisition, a volume by Ivan Turgenev, whose prose Apolinary admired for its clarity and quiet insight into human nature. The terrace lay bathed in gentle sunlight, shielded from the harsher glare of midday, and the air carried with it the faint, earthy scent of autumn leaves. For a while he allowed himself the rare luxury of stillness, eyes moving across the page, mind drifting easily between the printed words and his own reflections. He had been reading for some time when suddenly Eleonora appeared on the terrace, drawing him from the page. "Apolinary, there you are, my dear. I have been looking for you," she said. Apolinary, who had not yet entirely shaken the mild indignation of having been summoned here prematurely, set the book aside on the small table beside him and rose from his chair. "Eleonora, how fortunate that you have found me," he replied. "As it happens, I wish to speak with you in private as well." She regarded him for a moment, then smiled. "In that case, the moment seems most fitting. What would you say to some afternoon tea?" Apolinary inclined his head in assent. They walked arm in arm toward one of the garden pavilions, where they settled onto comfortable sofas. Before long, a young maid arrived with a tray of tea and a plate of assorted sweets, arranging them neatly before withdrawing. For an instant, the scene appeared perfectly serene. Yet Apolinary knew that beneath this carefully arranged calm, a conversation awaited that neither of them could much longer postpone. "Tell me, Eleonora," Apolinary began politely, "did the letter informing me of the wedding's postponement to next week somehow lose its way before reaching Warsaw? Or was I meant to find myself here already, quite by surprise?" Though his manner remained courteous, Eleonora detected at once the note of reproach beneath his words. She appeared troubled, visibly weighed down by guilt. Reaching across the small table, she placed her hand over his and met his gaze directly. "Forgive me, my friend," she said quietly. "I did not send you such a letter. I know you must be displeased with me, but you must try to understand. I had no other choice. I needed you here sooner. I need your help." Apolinary recognized genuine distress in her voice. "And I wish you to know," she continued, "that I acted upon advice given to me by Maria herself, not long before her mysterious disappearance." "Maria," Apolinary echoed, unable to conceal his surprise. "Yes. Several weeks before I learned of her journey to France, she wrote to me. In that letter, she said that if I should ever require assistance in uncovering the truth, or in finding answers to questions I could not resolve alone, I was to turn to you." Apolinary was momentarily struck dumb. For a brief span of time, he was incapable of speech or even reaction. His thoughts withdrew inward, crowding his mind. "At least it is comforting to know," he said at last, his voice low, "that even before her disappearance, Maria remained a woman concerned for the welfare of her friends." He paused, then straightened in his chair, collecting himself. "And what, then," he asked, now fully present once more, "is the matter that required my presence here?" It concerns the reason for the postponement of the wedding, Eleonora began. You may already have noticed that Clara has been behaving somewhat oddly. She has withdrawn from us and has become painfully sensitive to even the smallest remark. She was not like this a week ago. It is true that she never concealed her dislike of Johann, whom she has known barely 2 months, but she did not make a public display of it. She maintained appearances. She behaved normally. Her voice wavered slightly. But everything changed a few days before your arrival. Clara, she faltered, the words suddenly difficult to assemble. Go on, Eleonora, Apolinary encouraged her gently. That day, she continued at last, Friedrich and I were having dinner. Clara was due to return from the city. Johann had invited her to dine at one of the restaurants there. For a time, she remained alone in the gardens. Then, without warning, she ran toward us. Eleonora paused, her fingers tightening around her teacup. She was trembling. Her face was pale, and she could scarcely speak. We asked what had happened. Our daughter claimed that she had encountered Friedrich's mother, the Baroness, in the gardens, that they had spoken together, and that quite suddenly the Baroness told her that by marrying Johann, Clara would bring upon her family a terrible dark curse. Eleonora swallowed. After that, she said, the Baroness took her leave and disappeared somewhere among the trees. For a moment, Apolinary reflected in silence. Then he spoke, carefully. My dear Eleonora, he said, if memory serves me correctly, the Baroness was already well advanced in years, and we both know that with age, reality and belief often become entangled. It is not unheard of for an elderly mind to cling to imagined notions, especially if one has immersed oneself in certain esoteric writings. There would be nothing extraordinary in her sharing such thoughts with a granddaughter to whom she was, I believe, quite attached. Eleonora lowered her gaze, as though restraining an instinctive, sharper response. Then she looked up at him once more. And that, Apolinary, she said, her voice suddenly firm and resonant, would be a reasonable explanation, if only the Baroness had not been dead for the past 3 months. The words settled heavily between them, and in that instant, Apolinary understood that the matter before him was no longer merely one of family discord or wounded nerves, but something far more unsettling. Dead? Apolinary asked, his interest now unmistakably piqued. Yes. She died several months ago at her estate near Salzburg. The physicians declared it a heart attack. We were all there at the time, Friedrich, myself, and the children. That evening, my husband went to speak with his mother. He knocked, but there was no answer. When he entered the room, he made a dreadful discovery. His mother lay unconscious on the floor. Eleonora drew a slow breath. She was already gone. She had struck her head as well, most likely against the edge of her desk as she fell. Friedrich came to me at once, and together we decided it would be best not to tell the children. They loved the Baroness dearly. They were very attached to her. The next morning we told Clara and Joseph that their grandmother had been called away on urgent business in Vienna. To this day, we have not told them the truth. Her voice had softened, tinged now with sadness rather than alarm. What you tell me, Apolinary said after a pause, alters the matter entirely, my dear. He leaned forward slightly. Is Clara quite certain that she saw her grandmother and not some other elderly woman mistaken for her? Was it daylight at the time? Yes. I asked her the very same question, Eleonora replied at once. But Clara was absolutely certain. She insisted it was the Baroness. Since that moment, she has been terrified by those words and taken them wholly to heart. She began to claim that she could not marry Johann because if she did, something dreadful would befall us all. She looked at Apolinary imploringly. You remember what Clara was like as a child. She delighted in stories, especially the darker ones, not meant for children at all, and she believed in such things. Do you think your daughter might be, Apolinary began, but Eleonora interrupted him gently. Unwell, Perhaps, she said quietly. Or perhaps she simply possesses an overly vivid imagination. In any case, Friedrich and I concluded that in her present state she is in no condition to stand before the altar. She must be given time to recover. That is why we postponed the wedding. Apolinary considered her words. But what could I possibly do in such a situation? He asked. I hardly consider myself suited to the role of a child psychologist. That is not the kind of assistance I seek from you, my friend, Eleonora said. This matter is far more complicated. With that, she reached into the pocket of her gown and withdrew a folded letter, holding it between them as though it possessed a weight far greater than that of paper alone. What is this? Apolinary asked. It is a letter, Eleonora replied. One I received the morning after that incident with Clara. Or rather, it would be more accurate to say that I did not receive it at all. It was left for me. She folded her hands in her lap. When I awoke, it was lying on the dressing table in my chamber. I have no idea who placed it there or how. I will admit that I am a very sound sleeper. It would be difficult to wake me with the sound of opening doors or footsteps. She handed the letter to Apolinary. He opened it carefully. Inside was a brief message, written in German. Your daughter cannot marry this captain. I warn you. A threat, Apolinary observed quietly, though written in a remarkably fine hand. That is the worst of it, Apolinary, Eleonora said. It is the Baroness's handwriting. I know it. I would recognize it anywhere. He looked at her with renewed interest. A letter from a ghost, he said lightly. This does indeed grow interesting. If you permit it, Eleonora, I should like to keep this letter for the time being. Of course, she replied at once. Take it, if it may help in any way. It appears that someone is attempting to frighten both you and your daughter, Apolinary said, slipping the letter into the inner pocket of his jacket. And yet one must ask, how does that align with a baroness who, as you maintain, has been dead these past several months? I know, Eleonora said softly. It sounds utterly implausible. But I am afraid, my friend, for myself and for my family. That is why I summoned you here. This evening, Johann himself will come to dine with us, accompanied by his mother. Clara's French tutor will be present as well. I wish you to speak with them. Perhaps one of them has something to conceal. With that, she excused herself and returned to the palace. Apolinary remained seated for some time after she had gone, his untouched tea cooling beside him, staring ahead as he carefully arranged in his mind all that he had heard and all that he had learned. The game, he reflected, had already begun,